Have you ever wondered how the human nervous system works? Well, let's learn about that. Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of today's video learning about the human brain and nervous system. Today we're going to be talking about the lobes of the brain and how neuron impulses are transported to the brain. So let's learn about that.
This is what we're going to be going over in today's video. Let's go right into the lobes of the brain. These are the 4 lobes that we went over quickly in the other video. This is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Let's first go over the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is in charge of coordinating and processing important cognitive skills, including emotional expression, like being happy or sad, problem solving, memory language, and judgment. This is the control panel or the boss of your brain. That's how I like to remember it. Next is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is in charge of sensory information. You can think of that as your 5 senses. It's in charge of processing visual information, sensory information, so your 5 senses, and temperature, so whether it's hot or cold outside. Next is the occipital lobe, the red part here. The occipital lobe is in charge of primarily vision. It processes what you see, so it analyzes shapes and colors and draws conclusions about the images. So, what your eye see is transferred to the occipital lobe of your brain. It processes what you see. So, for example, if you see a tree or a flower outside, what your eye see is transferred to the occipital lobe in your brain, and it processes the image and tells you it's a purple flower. So that is the 4 lobes. But we can't forget the last one, the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is in charge of the memory of your brain, processing verbal sounds, nonverbal sounds, and understanding and your memories. For example, it can help you link the flavor of ice cream with a happy memory of you and your family. It links those things in your memory. So, let's go over a few review questions about the lobes in your brain. Can you tell me which lobe of the brain is in charge of sensory information? I'll give you 3 seconds, or you can pause this video and talk about it with your class. 3. The part of your brain that deals with sensory information is your parietal lobe, your 5 senses. Next, which part of your brain is in charge of vision and analyzing shapes and colors? I'll give you 3 seconds, or you can pause the video. That's right, it's the occipital lobe, right here in the back of your brain. My second last question, which part of the brain would we think of as the control panel or the boss of the brain? I'll give you 3 seconds again. If you guessed frontal lobe, you are right. Now, which part of the brain is in charge of memory and processing verbal and nonverbal sounds? That's right, it's the temporal lobe. Awesome job, everyone, and that's the 4 lobes of the brain. Now we're going to move on to the neuron and nervous system and how signals are sent to your brain. Now we're going to move on to neurons, how signals are sent to the brain. Let's start off with the structure right here. What is this, you may be wondering? This is a neuron. Now let's go over the roles of a neuron and what exactly a neuron does. So, a neuron is in charge of receiving signals or information. They want to integrate the incoming signals coming towards it, which will automatically go to your brain after it is sent through your body. It communicates signals to target cells as well. The neuron's functions are reflected in its structure. So let's look at its structure. Let's start off with this right here at the outside. It looks like branches, doesn't it? Those are called dendrites. And the point of dendrites is to receive and process the incoming information. This will take place in the dendrites and into this purple part right here. This purple part is called the soma, or the cell's body. In the middle is the nucleus. So, as the impulse travels from into the dendrites, it goes to the axon, which is this long part right here. So there's 3 things in the axon we have to look out for. There's the Schwann cell, myelin sheath, and the node of Ranvier. So the Schwann cells, they create the myelin sheath, which is the fatty substance that insulates the impulse coming through the neuron. The node of Ranvier is how the impulse travels through the axon. So, when a neuron impulse travels through the axon, something very important happens here called neuron repolarization, depolarization, and hyperpolarization, which we will go through very soon. At the very end of a neuron, here, this is called a synapse. Not snap as in snap your finger. It's called a synapse. It's a neuron-to-neuron connection. These connections, known as synapses, are where the information is carried to the next neuron. We will go over pre- and postsynaptic neurons in just a few moments. All these things I'm telling you that we're going to go over are in the key points section. So let's get to that right away so everyone can understand completely how a neuron impulse happens. So let's look at the key points. The first key point I have is that neurons do not touch. The gap is called the synapsis. So you might have thought that neurons attach at the end because the line of neurons goes all throughout your body, but not really. The gap in between is how the neuron impulse goes to the next neuron. So these are the axon terminal. The gap is called the synapse that the impulse travels through. And then the dendrites on the other side of the next neuron picks up the information, which leads us to presynaptic and postsynaptic. Neuron that carries the wave of depolarization is called presynaptic. The axon terminal, which has carried the impulse, is called presynaptic. Next neuron that receives the stimulus is called postsynaptic. So the neuron on the other side, the dendrites, are postsynaptic. Let's look at the next thing that's very important because you might be wondering what depolarization and stimulus are. These neurotransmitters tell the neuron what to do next. So the information in the neurotransmitter tells it what to do next. These next 4 words are very important and have a lot to do with this whole process. Neuron at rest, neuron depolarize, neuron repolarize, and neuron hyperpolarize. This whole system works really fast throughout the neuron. It happens right here. As I said, that the node of Ranvier is how the impulse is transmitted. It's transmitted through there, and this happens very quickly throughout it. So I'm going to go over quickly what each thing means, and then we're going to look at a graph to help us understand it more clearly. So let's go over neuron at rest first. Neuron at rest. This is when there is absolutely nothing happening, so the neuron hasn't received any information yet. Nothing has happened because there is no response. This is called our all or nothing response. Next is depolarized. This is when the channels that let the sodium ion into the cell are opened. So when the sodium ion channels are open, sodium quickly leaves the cell, which depolarizes it. Next is repolarized. That's when the gates for the potassium ion pumps are let open and they flow out of the cell. Hyperpolarization helps us bounce back to the normal spot at which the impulse was at before this transmission happened. Now I want to show you guys on a graph what this would look like because it's much easier to explain. Okay guys, so I have a picture and a graph to go over to help you understand this more. So we have -70. This is where the neuron starts, and -70. Nothing has happened yet. It's a neuron at rest. Then -55 is the action potential. This happens or occurs, say if a spider was crawling on you and you saw it, the threshold has to get to -55 for something to happen, for you to have a reaction, and for the neuron impulse to travel across the axon and to the brain. So it has to get to -55. Then it will depolarize. The sodium ion channels will open, and positive sodium ions will come in. When other sodium ion channels open, the other ones will too. This will result in the charges changing throughout the axon. So it'll be positive inside because positive sodium ions are coming in, negative outside, but then it'll swap again to get back to normal when it's repolarized, and it'll be negative charge back on the inside and positive will go back outside. So positive charges will come in and it'll flop, and negative will be outside, and then it'll be negative outside, and then it'll flop again back to normal, and we'll have positive outside and negative inside. Because your body wants to rebalance the charge and it will come back to resting order. That is repolarization. That is when these potassium ion channels open, giving potassium negative outside to try to balance it all out. It does this so well that it goes so far below -70 that it is hyperpolarized. But don't worry, your body will get it back to normal again and get the right amount of potassium back in and the right amount of sodium back out. So it is negative on the inside and positive on the outside. And that's pretty much just what it means. When the neuron impulse goes through, it depolarizes, and then you'll get potassium inside, and then you'll get sodium inside and potassium outside. And this happens in a matter of seconds. So it'll flip-flop. So it'll be positive in, negative out, and then don't worry guys, we just have one more thing to go over. I know this is a lot of information, but don't worry, we'll review it. We're going to go over lastly the main 3 receptors. So let's go through a whole example of how the impulse will travel through your body. This will go over everything that we talked about as well as these main 3 receptors. So let's go for the example of, say, you put your hand on a hot stove. So this is what's going to happen. First, your body takes the sensory receptor impulses. Then they are transmitted to the spinal cord. Then it relays the message to your brain, and your brain indicates what to do with this message. Then your brain sends the message back to the effectors, or the muscles in your body, and finally your muscles receive the motor neurons to take the action. So I know you heard these 3 things when I was saying it: sensory, relay, and motor. Now I'm going to tell you what those 3 things are. These are different types of receptors. So sensories are neuron receptors that take the impulse to the spinal cord. Like I said, the relay neuron transports or relays the impulse message to your brain from your spinal cord. That's just like it sounds, really. And motor transports from the brain to the rest of your body. So once your brain figures out what to do, it transports from the brain to your body, and it tells your body what to do, so your body will take your hand right off that hot stove. So when the impulse goes to the neuron, and you reach the threshold of -55, it'll go and depolarize from the dendrites all the way down to here. So remember what happens? So the nerve impulse goes from each node and it is safely insulated by the myelin sheath and the Schwann shells. And we know what happens here. Once it gets to -55, it's going to depolarize. When it depolarizes, the sodium ion channels open and positive sodium comes in, which makes it positive inside. So it goes to the peak of +40, but it needs to rebalance the charge. So it is repolarized. When it is repolarized, the potassium ion channels open and gets some negative potassium ions outside. So it makes outside negative. Then it goes so far negative that it is hyperpolarized. After it's hyperpolarized, the potassium sodium ion channels flip it back again, so we have the rebalanced charges in resting order with negative on the inside and positive on the outside. So it gets enough of the potassium back and gets rid of the sodium. So that's basically the neuron's response and how the nervous system works. To go deeper in depth, there are two different types of nervous system. There's your peripheral nervous system and your central nervous system. But that's a video for another time. I hope you learned a lot about the brain in this two-part session. If you need to go over and review some of this, feel free to rewind. Hope you enjoyed these videos.